Marlene Dietrich and Edith Piaf shared a stage exactly once. A benefit concert in Paris in the late 1940s. Nobody photographed the moment they stood together in the wings afterward. Nobody needed to. The accounts that survived that evening are not abundant. There was no reviewer present who wrote a detailed description of the backstage hour that followed the performance. There was no photographer who had arranged in advance to document what happened between the two performers after the audience was gone and the house lights came up. What remained was the kind of record that significant moments sometimes leave behind when they occur outside the official frame of documentation. The testimony of people who were in the building, who were in the corridor, who were near enough to the wings to observe without being inside the event itself. To understand why the evening mattered, and why the specific encounter in the wings afterward was the part that people remembered most precisely, you have to understand what it meant in the Paris of that era for these two women to occupy the same stage. Marlene Dietrich, by the late 1940s, had been a presence in the world's cultural imagination for nearly 2 decades. Born in Berlin, trained in German theater and cabaret, she had been transformed by Joseph von Sternberg and Hollywood into something that the film industry had not quite produced before. A star whose presence on screen communicated entire interior landscapes through the smallest shifts of expression, who projected a self so completely constructed and so completely inhabited that it became its own kind of truth. She had also, in the years during the war, made choices of a specific moral and political character. She had performed for Allied troops, had traveled with the forces, had put herself in physical danger in the service of a position she had taken about the country of her birth and the regime that had taken it over. Edith Piaf had her own relationship to the war years, which was different from Dietrich's in its texture and its moral complexity. She had remained in France during the occupation, had performed for German officers as well as for French audiences, and the accounts of that period and of her choices during it were not, and have not been since, entirely straightforward. What is clear is that she used what access she had to help people who needed help, including prisoners and others who were vulnerable in ways the occupation made more dangerous. The war years, for Piaf, were not the same clean, moral story that they were for Dietrich. They were the story of a person who was present in an occupied city, who made the choices available to her in that specific context, and who carried the complications of those choices quietly. The accounts describe this in the minimal way that people describe things they witnessed, that they understood to be significant, but that they also felt some reserve about documenting too precisely. What they describe is not a dramatic scene. There was no visible emotion of the kind that the press, had they been present, would have found useful. There was no embrace, no formal greeting of the kind that performed warmth between celebrities' takes. There were two women standing in a narrow backstage space, speaking to each other in the way that people speak when they have a great deal they could say, and a limited amount they are willing to say it aloud. The conversation lasted, by the accounts that have placed a duration on it, somewhere between 20 minutes and an hour. This wide range reflects both the unreliability of duration estimates in retrospective accounts and the possibility that different witnesses observed different portions of the encounter. What the duration estimates agree on is that it was not brief. It was not the exchange of a few pleasantries and a professional farewell that such encounters often become when they involve two performers of significant reputation who have no established personal relationship. What was said has not been preserved in any form that has been generally accepted as reliable. Both women gave, in the years following that evening, occasional oblique references to the encounter that confirmed its existence and suggested something of its quality without providing any specific content. The obliqueness was not, by the available evidence, a product of any hostility between them or of a desire to keep the content private for strategic reasons. It seemed to be, instead, a genuine reflection of the nature of what had been exchanged, something that was real and that had mattered, but that did not translate easily into the kind of language that interviews and memoirs use. Because the language that interviews and memoirs use is designed to be understood by people who were not present, and what had happened in those 20 or 60 minutes had been entirely dependent on the presence of the two specific people it had happened between. There are encounters that survive in the record because one party or the other described them with sufficient detail to give subsequent readers a purchase on what occurred. And there are encounters that survive primarily as a shape, as the outline of something significant, without the interior being available for examination. The wing conversation between Piaf and Dietrich belongs to the second category. Its significance was confirmed by both of them in their own separate, oblique ways over the years that followed. Its content was not. By the late 1940s, both women had arrived at a position in the world of European entertainment that was, in its altitude and its authority, similar, though the paths by which they had reached it were almost entirely unlike. Dietrich was a movie star who also performed. Piaf was a performer who had never crossed into film in any significant way. Dietrich was German-American, internationally distributed. Piaf was Parisian in the most specific and rooted sense, a product of the streets and the small clubs in the Moulin Rouge and the Olympia, a singer whose art was inseparable from the French language and from the particular emotional world that language contained. Benefit concerts in Paris in this era were particular kinds of events, organized around specific causes, often connected to post-war reconstruction or cultural institutions, and typically featuring a roster of performers who were each significant in their own world and who were, by the nature of the occasion, placed alongside each other in a way that their ordinary performance careers would not have arranged. The evening was not, by most accounts, a carefully planned double headline. It was the particular organized generosity of a specific cultural moment, when performers were being asked to give their time to causes that the post-war world required. And the particular configuration of that evening, two women, two very different careers, one stage in the city that had claimed both of them in different ways, was not something either of them could have easily arranged on their own. Piaf performed. Dietrich performed. The order of the evening and the structure of the program varied in the accounts that have been preserved. What is consistent across all the accounts is that both performers were present, that both performed, and that after the performances were over and the audience had been released into the Paris evening, the two women found themselves in the same backstage space. The wings of a Paris concert hall in the late 1940s were not glamorous. They were the functional underpinning of what the audience saw, narrow, crowded with equipment and personnel, lit by the minimal lighting necessary for stage operations rather than by anything designed for comfort or appearance. This was the world that Piaf had navigated her entire adult life. She was entirely at home in it. Dietrich, whose career had included decades of studio environments and touring arrangements that were more formally organized, was not a stranger to backstage spaces either, but the specific texture of this world, its physicality, its proximity, its functional disorder, was closer to Piaf's native environment than to Dietrich's. They stood in the wings together. The people who were present, stagehands, musicians, a few of the evening's organizers who had remained backstage after the audience had been released, registered this without entirely knowing what to make of it. Two performers of this visibility in the same narrow corridor was not a common occurrence, and the people who had worked in Paris entertainment long enough to have a sense of what was common and what was not recognized, without discussing it among themselves, that what they were witnessing was not the ordinary kind of backstage encounter. Paris had given each of them something the world elsewhere could not quite offer. For Piaf, it had given everything: origin, language, audience, the specific streets that had made her voice what it was. For Dietrich, it had given a particular seriousness, a credibility that accompanied the glamour rather than being replaced by it, an audience that understood what she was doing in terms that went beyond the surface of the performances. In those wings, in those 20 or 60 minutes, two women who had each found in Paris something irreplaceable stood together in a narrow backstage corridor and spoke in the specific way that people speak when they know the other person will understand what they are not saying. The stage behind them was dark. The audience was gone. The city was outside, continuing in its own way, indifferent to what was happening in the wings of one of its theaters. And in that corridor, in that space between the performance and the rest of the evening, something passed between them that the record was not adequate to contain. There is something in the specific quality of that encounter, in its refusal to become a story with a clear beginning, middle, and end, its resistance to being translated into the language that most encounters between famous people get translated into, that is itself a kind of document. What two performers of that stature chose to keep private, when everything they did was subject to a degree of public attention that most people never experience, was by definition something they had decided deserved protecting. They protected it not through deliberate secrecy, but through the more ordinary mechanism of simply not describing it, of allowing it to remain in the category of things that happened, without being converted into the category of things that were told. The wings of that Paris concert hall have long since been reconfigured or demolished. The evening is not commemorated anywhere. The conversation that took place in that corridor left no transcript, no photograph, no contemporaneous account detailed enough to be quoted with confidence. What it left was the awareness in the people who were nearby that something worth witnessing had briefly occupied a space they happened to be in. And what it left in the two people who had the conversation was whatever was said between them, which they chose to keep, which they kept for the remainder of their lives, and which the record, for once, was honest enough not to invent. What remained, in the end, was the fact of it, that the two most powerful women in European entertainment in the late 1940s had stood together in the wings of a Paris concert hall for somewhere between 20 minutes and an hour, and had spoken to each other in a way that both of them had reason to remember, and that neither of them had seen a way to explain. It did not need to be recorded. It needed only to have happened, and it had.